So, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our Zoom event with Helen Fry. Helen, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We're all really interested to find out all about your latest book. It's a shame we have to be on Zoom. I know it's good for a lot of people, but it would be lovely to, if we'd have been able to meet in person like we have done with your other book. So, but anyway, welcome. And just for everybody that if you'd like to ask Helen a question, if you go to the bar at the bottom, there is a Q&A button. So if you type your questions in, and then either Helen will pick them up or I'll pick them up and be able to ask you the question. So Helen Fry is a specialist in the history of British intelligence. She's the author of The Walls Have Ears, The London Cage, and more than 20 books focusing on intelligence and prisoner of war in World War II. Helen has a PowerPoint to show us, so without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Helen. So thank you so much for joining us and welcome.
Thank you. Well, thank you for inviting me this evening. As the PowerPoint's coming up on your screen, I'm always delighted. Just check I can see it. Yes, there we go. I'm always delighted to be giving a talk locally, although I know it's virtually at the moment, on something which is local to Chorleywood, or fairly local. Some of you may have heard or read or heard one of my talks on The Walls Have Ears about Latimer House and Wilton Park. Wilton Park, where they also bugged the conversations of German prisoners of war during the wartime. But MI9 also had a history at a different part of the site at Wilton Park. So I will come to that shortly in my talk. So for you, I think it's probably quite special this evening in that it has a very, very local link. First slide, please. We got next slide. Thank you. So I want to just outline, what was MI9? Many of you have, well, almost certainly, of course, heard of MI5 and MI6. I'm not sure if you're aware, but it used to go from MI1 to MI19. Some of them are still around, some of them aren't anymore. But MI9 was responsible for prisoners of war during the Second World War. It was formed in December 1939, and the idea was that one of your most important sources of intelligence are your prisoners. And I mentioned the bugging operation, and I'm not going to mention it again this evening, but just to say that MI9 initially was responsible for intelligence from German or Italian, so enemy prisoners of war, before it became so large it split into MI9 and MI19, and that was then dealt with under MI19. And MI9, the other part of MI9, was dealing with intelligence from our prisoners of war. And MI9 believed that fighting personnel should be brought back from behind enemy lines or from prisoner of war camps. They were probably, in fact, from my research, they are the only, as far as I can tell, apart from the American link to this, which I'll come to, they are really the only country which really thought about the welfare and escape and evasion of our prisoners. And so MI9 this evening, the branch that I'm talking about, is about escape and evasion. And you can see in the top of your screen there, this is a really rare photograph of Wilton Park, of MI9's headquarters. It had started in the Metropole building, the old War Office in London, and then when that had been hit in October 1940, it moved out to purpose-built site at Wilton Park, started in the White House actually, and then had these ancillary buildings that you can see there amongst the trees. And in the bottom of the screen, you can see the commanding officer, Brigadier Norman Crockett. And he was absolutely central to the success of MI9 because he was the one that coined the phrase escape-mindedness. And this was a whole philosophy that underpinned MI9. And of course, we didn't have, you know, when MI9 was formed in December 1939, there were really effectively no prisoners, no escapers and evaders. But he had the foresight to begin this organisation before it was essentially needed. And he's pictured there in his office at Wilton Park. He also realised that personnel, in the moments after capture, if they've been shot down and they've bailed out, in those moments after capture, or if they hadn't been captured but they were evading capture, they were disorientated, shocked, whatever, it wouldn't necessarily come naturally to them to think logically or to think about ways of evading or escaping. And so he actually instigated a training program, and I'm not sure how many people realise, but the majority of personnel, it was all services, and including commandos and Navy, Fleet Air Arm, those that were going into action had training in MI9's escape and evasion lectures. And I had the privilege of actually working through some of, well, now declassified files. There are just thousands of them, and I'll just give you a couple of highlights from the training lectures. And of course, some of them are quite funny, really. One of the key things, of course, of the first command is do not be captured. That's sort of obvious. But if you are captured, it says, remember that there is an organisation that is looking after you, that is thinking of you. And that was terribly important psychology for airmen and soldiers. But if they were evading capture, one of the key things was to blend into the background. And again, you might not necessarily think logically about how you blend into the background. Well, in France, of course, it was suggested that you don't walk in a British way, whatever a British way is, certainly with a stick, which is a very British thing to do, try and acquire a beret. It was all about blending in to the background. And one story which comes up in the training lectures, one of the escapers later, it was actually during 1940, later in 1940, he'd actually escaped from a prisoner of war camp, managed to get a bicycle, and he'd cycled 400 kilometers across Nazi-occupied Europe and into France. Fantastic. He's almost there, except when he came to this town, he cycled round the roundabout the wrong way. And there was a policeman, unfortunately, on the corner, looked and thought, hang on a minute, he just cycled round the wrong way. So he gave himself up by purely little actions like that. So that was one of the examples given in the training lectures. Next. And many of you will be familiar with the escape gadgets. These were immortalised, as we know, in Ian Fleming's novels for the James Bond character. They were known as Q gadgets, Q being the inventor in the Bond films of these gadgets. And of course, working on the MI9 files, and I did start on this a number of years ago, I was quite naive, and reading in these files some of the stuff which later appears in Fleming's novels, I just naively thought Fleming had invented them all. But of course he hadn't. He had been attached to, he was within the Naval Intelligence Division that was attached to Latimer House, and he frequently visited Wilton Park, that we know. So he was familiar with these gadgets. And on your screen there, you can see one of the key characters used by MI9. This is Christopher Clayton Hutton, and he was affectionately known as Clutty. And when he came for an interview at the War Office, he was being interviewed, and the guy said to him, just tell me something about yourself. And Clutty said, well, I've always been interested in escapology, illusions, and I followed Houdini quite a bit. And he said, I met Houdini on a number of occasions and I gave him a challenge, one of his escape challenges. And instantly he had the attention of the chap that was interviewing him. And he realised he had something quite unorthodox here. And he realised that Clutty could probably be the man they were looking for to be able to invent these tiny, or source tiny compasses and the maps I'll talk about in a moment into ordinary objects. The challenge for MI9 was how to send escape gadgets into the camps, and it was Clutty's job to source, think of the ideas. Some of the stuff he invented himself. He had the help of Charles Fraser Smith. Some of you may have heard of Charles Fraser Smith. He lived locally in Buckinghamshire too. So these two guys were central, and it was Clutty who thought of ways and acquired the help of various firms to create the miniature compasses, and they become, as they're very famous. And you can see one of those courtesy of Phil Froome's collection there at the top of your screen. In fact, these items are all courtesy of Phil Froome. And Clutty there invented the escape boot. You can see that the bottom of it looks a bit like an ordinary shoe. And of course, if you think about an airman who's evading capture, if he's running through an area with his boots on, it's a dead giveaway, even if he's got civilian clothes. So this could detach, the top part of the boot could detach, and it just looked like a civilian shoe. So incredibly important. In the bottom of your screen, you can see again one of the other ways that these miniature compasses were hidden inside ordinary objects, so that hopefully the Nazis wouldn't find them. And this, of course, is the shaving brush, which unscrewed. And if airmen and soldiers could keep their shaving kit in the prisoner of war camp, they always had a miniature compass with them. And recently, I was actually looking at a collection where the compass was incredibly tiny, almost much smaller than the nail on your finger. And I just thought it was extraordinary that they could create something so tiny. But over 1.3 million of these compasses were manufactured for MI9 across the wartime. Next. I love this one. The Monopoly board looks very innocent, this Monopoly board. Well, of course, Clayton Hutton actually managed to get Waddingtons on board because prisoners could receive parcels, Red Cross, none of this stuff went through Red Cross parcels, none of the escape gadgets, but they were allowed to receive parcels from the Red Cross, for example. So MI9 decided to create fictitious charities. So there's all sorts of charities they created, like the Victualers Association, or I don't know, something like the Women's Knitting Society, all completely fake. But of course the Germans didn't realize this, and they were able to send in parcels to the prisoners. And some of those parcels had the escape gadgets in, some of them didn't. One of the things that Waddingtons did was to modify some of their games, Monopoly being the key one of the key ones. So if you've got one of these in your attic, an original MI9 Monopoly board, apparently they are very, very valuable and incredibly rare. But it meant that things could be hidden inside the little pieces. In the board itself, I understand that you can actually have a map in between. Of course, once you open it, it's destroyed the game. And how you knew if this was an escape and evasion Monopoly set from MI9, it would have a dot. If I'm not mistaken, it was on Mayfair. Tiny dot. If you saw that was the clue. That was one of the clues, the giveaways. Next. And the chess sets, incidentally, were also quite useful because inside the knight, the chess piece, the knight, they could actually line it. MI9 lined it so that you could actually put ink. And that was, of course, very useful in the camps. And I'll come to some of the antics, as I call it, that the prisoners got up to in the camps. And all of this was being orchestrated by MI9 from Wilton Park at Beaconsfield. That was their central headquarters and where the mainstay of the personnel were based. The maps become incredibly important too. And one of the challenges for Clayton Hutton was how to print maps in sufficient detail without them blurring. And you can see on this silk map that the lines are as good as if they've been printed on paper. To look at them up close, and I'm not sure if any of you have one of MI9's maps, or have seen any of this incredibly fine detail, and the ink hasn't blurred, and it's printed on both sides. And to do this, Clutty experimented with a number of things, but he realized that by adding pectin, because that's stuff that's added to jam to help with setting, that this would help the ink and made sure that it wasn't blurred. So there were the silk maps. There was a risk, of course, that silk could become in short supplies, particularly if the Germans blockaded certain parts where it came from, some from the Middle East, some further, and particularly from the Japanese theatre of war from Asia. So Clutty also thought of other ways of printing maps, and there were the famous tissue maps, incredibly fine maps which could roll up very small. They didn't rustle. It was another important thing about both the silk maps and the tissue maps, that they couldn't hopefully be found on airmen or soldiers, but the tissue maps could be rolled up so small and fit inside, for example, fake sweets. I love this. MI9 created fake sweets to hide this stuff in. And the maps, again, millions of those were produced during the wartime, that became incredibly important. They were produced for all areas in which MI9 operated. So not just Western Europe, but also the Middle East, the Far East, and hopefully I'll have time to say a little bit about the Far East, or maybe you can ask me in question time. Greece, of course, the Balkans, Scandinavia, wherever MI9 had operations or agents, maps were produced. Next. But of course, for MI9 to be successful, it needed to set up, or it needed escape lines. Again, there are lots of major and minor escape lines, but I focus on three main ones in my book. I have to say at this point that one of the challenges in writing the book was just containing the sheer volume of information. Tons and tons of it. I mean, when I scoped it from the thousands upon thousands of files, not just about MI9 as an organisation and what's coming out of Wilton Park from that end, but the escape lines, you've got the escape reports from individual escapers. So across all theatres of war, thousands upon thousands. So having to contain this material, and the same with the escape lines. But I hope to give you a flavour of some of the stuff that I've uncovered. So one of the main routes came actually out of Belgium from Brussels. It was known as the Comet Line. The Comet Line ran, as I say, from Brussels into France, over the Somme. They often went over the Somme by boat at night with their parcels, as the airmen and soldiers were known, right through Paris. And what I find extraordinary is that they're going right under the noses of the Nazis. They do not avoid Paris, which I would have thought would be quite difficult to hide airmen and soldiers or smuggle them through, but they managed it. Cause a series of safe houses, guides, helpers, the escape lines, I'll come to the helpers in a moment, needed the helpers to make this successful. So they're traveling through Paris, down to the Pyrenees, into Spain to Bilbao. And at the other side, Creswell, Sir Michael Creswell, who's a diplomat at the embassy, he's usually picking them up. But if you think about the challenge of crossing those Pyrenees in all weathers, you can see here the Bidassoa River, that looks pretty unassuming there, but the torrents and currents for crossing that at various points were quite a challenge, and one of the agents actually lost his life during one of the crossings. Another, so the Comet Line, I'll come back to part of that shortly. Florentino there, one of the mountain guides that took parcels over the Pyrenees. The Pat line, which ran out of Marseille, I have some news stories on an American, Varian Fry actually, who's been recognised for saving artists like Marc Chagall and other artists and also anti-Nazis. But he was also helping MI9, and this is a new strand of the story, alongside the Pat line in Marseille in 1940. So incredible story there, where he inadvertently ends up working for British intelligence for a short time. But the Pat line runs from Marseille down to the other side, the nearest side of the Pyrenees, through Perpignan. And of course, along the Pyrenees, you've got various families and safe houses. And the third line, which I really focus on as well, is the Shelburne line. And these were the sea evacuations. There are sea evacuations from Brittany across to Devon and Cornwall, to Dartmouth, but primarily after the main base of the flotilla moves to the Helford River in Falmouth, they're going across from Brittany to Falmouth. And they are taking agents in one way for SIS, and bringing escapers and evaders out. And their operations begin in 1943, actually, so a little bit later. But what strikes me, and I've been reading a bit more about those operations recently, the sea evacuations, is just the sheer tenacity and the fact that they managed to do it. I mean, I think there are lots of options across land, but sea, they often, well, they did, they sailed always on a moonless night. So never by the light of the moon, in challenging conditions with a heavily defended coast. Anyway, you can read a bit more about that in my book. Next slide. And I mentioned the helpers. For me, this was really a turning point when I started to understand some of the stories of the helpers. And there are so many, I'm talking just about Western Europe, but there are too many, unfortunately, to have reflected properly in my book. And I think there's always more that can be done. So the last word certainly hasn't been said on this. Dédé de Jong, Dédé was her sort of nickname, André de Jong, very famous leader of the Comet line. And I uncovered with her story is very well known. It's told well by Foote and Langley in their book, and Airy Neve, of course, in his book. But Dédé, of course, is the young 21-year-old that takes half a dozen, 2 or 3 initially, parcels over the Pyrenees and turns up at the British Embassy. And of course, they think to start with that potentially she's a double agent or a spy, or that she's been turned. But in fact, she becomes the leader of the line from Brussels all the way down to the Pyrenees. But that work she couldn't have done without another family. And this, for me, I'm really proud that this went into the book, that I managed to come across. The family reached out to me towards the end of the writing of the book, the de Grief family. And they knew Dédé back in Brussels. And when the Germans had occupied Brussels, occupied Belgium, they'd fled. And Dédé and his family were actually working before the Comet line was formally founded in the summer of 1941. They were already helping airmen and soldiers out in 1940. So if you think about the evacuation at Dunkirk, May, June 1940, huge success. Of course, we think of 300,000 of the personnel that were evacuated in these little fishing boats and across back to Britain. But when I was researching this book, I didn't realise that 50,000 were left behind. Staggering number. 50,000 that went into prisoner of war camps, and 5,000 that evaded capture and went into hiding. Airy Neve and Jimmy Langley, those giants of MI9, were of course with their respective regiments holding German forces back so that the evacuations could take place, and they were one of those. They were amongst those that were captured. And the success of MI9, just so that I remember at this point to mention, of those that didn't get out around Dunkirk, so we've got 50,000, as I said, that went into prisoner of war camps, 5,000 that go into hiding. MI9, the files say at the end of the war, we brought back, i.e. MI9, all but 300 of them during the wartime. They managed to smuggle them out. Absolutely incredible legacy. And so Dede was part of that, the de Greef family, in 1940. And the de Greef family fled to the Pyrenees, and they set up a series of safe houses, and they managed to continue the escape line, the Comet line, even in spite of decimation and betrayal of the Comet line in 42 and 43. Pat O'Leary there, Pat, who's the leader of the Pat line that ran out of Marseille. Again, you can read his story in the book next. I tried hard to find a photograph that gives us an idea of the sheer scale of trying to climb, get over the Pyrenees. They couldn't use ordinary routes because, of course, they would be discovered. I mean, the Germans weren't stupid. They knew that there were escape lines. They were always trying to penetrate them. Excuse me. You can see how isolated in that photograph some of the dwellings and farms are that would have been used. And often routes had to be found. Sometimes they were donkey trails, sometimes they were new trails. And every time there'd been a betrayal or risk that they'd been discovered, that the lines had been discovered in that area, they had to go higher. And it was incredibly challenging, as I've said already, and hard to find a photograph really that gives that impression. Next. But it's not just these lines that I've concentrated on. I love this photograph of Renata Vacicani della Torre. I never quite pronounced her name correctly, but she was again young like Dede de Jong, and she was based in Milan. And what I uncover in my research is quite a bit of stuff, interesting stuff on Italy. And Italy is an area that's often overlooked in stuff on MI9. MI9 did operate in Italy. Sam Derry there. Sam was a prisoner of war in Chieti. I'll come back to Renata shortly. Sam Derry was in Camp 21, Chieti in northern Italy. He was in charge of a lot of the escape and evasion attempts out of that camp. And when the Germans were advancing in 42, 43, and the Italian guards were fleeing, Sam Derry decided not to escape himself. He got 50 of his men out, of fellow prisoners out, and he stayed behind because he didn't want to, he wanted to stay behind to help the others, but he did not put himself first. It consequently meant that he became a prisoner of the Germans, and they rounded up those that were left in the camp and were about to transport them. And it was while they were being transported by train. Some think they were going to Auschwitz. I'm not sure whether they would have been transferred to a concentration camp, to be honest, but they were being transferred to Germany to an unknown fate. Sam Derry, in typical Fleming James Bond style, actually jumped off the moving train. He did injure himself in that and went into hiding. And he made his way down to Rome. And I'm not sure whether you've heard of this story, but he founded the Rome Escape Organisation, and he worked alongside a Monsignor Hugh O'Flaherty, an Irish priest who was training priests in the Vatican in the college next door. And eventually Derry is betrayed, and he's working just outside the Vatican, and he's then smuggled into the Vatican. So we have an incredible story where MI9 operates. They're sending secret messages to Sam Derry inside the Vatican. And I do raise some very interesting questions in my book about the role of the Vatican. I mean, I was astounded to find a couple of declassified Foreign Office files which show that the Vatican, or parts of the Vatican, were certainly involved in helping MI9's effort. And there were at any one time half a dozen to a dozen Allied prisoners of war being sheltered inside the Vatican. And for me, it raises a lot more of questions about the so-called neutral Vatican in the wartime. You can also read about how the Vatican was facilitating money to be sent to Sam Derry and his organisation with O'Flaherty to support those prisoners that were outside the area and of course in hiding, and there were thousands of them. And of course, as the Allies start to progress up through Italy, there's absolute chaos in terms of prisoners and prisoner of war camps. Some of them are just, I mean, Norman Crockett said from Beaconsfield headquarters that they were to stay put because at least MI9 would know where they were. But in the chaos, many of them fled into the hillsides, and Sam Derry would link up with them. And he and O'Flaherty actually managed to save over 4,000 Allied prisoners of war. Quite incredible legacy. I find quite exciting. And Sam is smuggled in to the Vatican as a cardinal. And Renata there, just 21 years old, she looks glamorous, and she was incredibly beautiful, intellectual, university educated, but she was shy. And I think from that photograph, you don't get the sense of how shy she was. But she ran an intelligence station for MI9 in the heart of Milan. Of course, she is betrayed at a certain point, as was the risk, and she spends a bit of time in Milan prison. But of course, she's broken out of the prison. You can read how she's broken out of the prison. She's an expert skier, and she is able to accompany airmen and soldiers through a very difficult passage through northern Italy into Switzerland. So she is absolutely crucial in the link between northern Italy and Switzerland. And again, you know, those escape lines were line, it was really just one way out into Switzerland, are not really often told, or perhaps people just haven't come across the research next. So I think we mustn't forget Italy. The helpers and the guides I've mentioned already were the inspirational part of this story. Count Georges d'Outremont there, he's accompanying airmen and soldiers from Brussels to Paris. He is thought to have been betrayed, and so MI9 thinks he's at risk, and so he is actually smuggled out down the escape line. He's not the only one who's smuggled out, but he goes back again for MI9, and you can read his daring story. And at the end of towards the end of the war, he ends up enlisting in the Belgian SAS. So incredibly brave legacy that again I was able to include in the book that's not really known. Michoud, a young Michoud who ends up saving the Comet Line in 1944. Next, Nemo, I'll come to in a moment. He was a leader of the Comet Line after Dédé de Jong. Yeah, the whole thing of betrayal. For me, writing the book, it was really hard. Those bits on betrayal, you kind of think you can be academic and detached from it. But the stories where the Comet Line in particular, but it wasn't only the Comet Line, it was also the Pat Line, were betrayed, decimated by those who had turned either double agent, traitors, or they'd done it for money or power or whatever their motives. Harold Cole was one of them. He was turned by the Abwehr, by the German Secret Service, to work for them, and he did the terrible thing of still continuing to work for MI9 for a short time, but actually being in the hands of the Abwehr. And he brought so-called American airmen to the heart of Brussels. And in 1942, there's a very famous betrayal called the Marshall Affair. And for me, this was the turning point in the book, in the understanding of why the helpers risked their lives. So I was lucky to interview Elsie Marshall, and Elsie was just 16 years old. Can you imagine? She was still at school, just 16 years old when she started to work for the escape line. And I was lucky to interview her in Brussels last year. And her whole family in this Marshall Affair in November 42, thought to have been betrayed by Harold Cole, were decimated. After their arrest, the family were arrested. 100 others of the Comet line were arrested, and most of them were believed to have been shot or executed. But Elsie Marshall did survive. Photograph there of Frederick de Jong, Andre de Jong's father. He also worked for the escape line, but he did not survive. He was betrayed. He did manage to flee to Paris, but he was betrayed and arrested and did not survive. Andre de Jong, Dede, you remember that young photograph of Dede, who led the Comet line? She was arrested in early 1943 and spent time in prisons and concentration camps. She did survive, but Nemo took over. Albert Grindle took over, and always the risk of betrayal. And of course, they don't know where it's coming from. And at any point along that route from Brussels to Paris down to the Pyrenees was vulnerable to betrayal. And I said to Elsie Marshall, as I said, she's 97 going on 98, one of the few survivors now of the Comet line helpers. Why did you do it? She had that look of defiance still. She said, we saw every day the trains taking our food, taking our fuel, our coal. We were cold, we were hungry. But she said, most importantly, they took my Jewish friends, our Jewish friends. And she said, out with the Nazis. I still remember when she said that to me. We thought, out with the Nazis. And they saw colleagues shot. She saw one of the colleagues shot in front of her. Still, they knew the risks, and still they were prepared to work for this line. She also told me that they had no idea that it was MI9, and that they never heard of MI9 until after the war. All they knew was that there was an organisation just outside London or in London helping them. And, you know, the level of trust, extraordinary. And as I say, for me, that was a turning point in trying to understand their acts of resistance, because they could have just waited for the Allies to liberate. I mean, okay, it was a few years, but they could have waited, but they chose a different path. Next. Yes, you can't do any escape stories and anything on escape and evasion without escape from Colditz. Well, I don't propose to go through stories on the escapes from Colditz. They're well known. You've got that wonderful photograph there of Airy Neve. Airy Neve being the first British prisoner to escape from Colditz and return to Britain. And it was said in the MI9 war diary, there is an entry when the message comes through that Airy Neve's made it back. He hasn't quite got back to Wilton Park, but at Wilton Park there was a cheer, and apparently at lunch out came the pink champagne and the pink gin, and they toasted his success. So I think that's rather marvellous, actually, that it's that bond between MI9 and every single one of those prisoners that manages to escape and get back to England. They've got that bond. And as I said, it says in the war diary that a cheer went up and there were celebrations. His escape is mentioned in the war diary. So we know a lot about the escapes, but I want to give you a local one. Because somebody local in Beaconsfield, when I was starting out on the research, said to me, oh, of course, you know Susan Brummel. Well, she worked for MI9, but she was just a cook. She lived locally, but she just passed away. And I never got to interview her, which was a shame. But, you know, she was just a cook at Wilton Park. Well, I think I've learned now never to believe when you're told that someone's just a cook, because I find her in the MI9 war diaries as the right-hand person to Norman Crockett. So she's the sort of PA or secretary to the head of MI9. Anyway, this person said to me, her brother made an escape during the wartime, and it was quite a daring escape, and wondered if I could find out anything about it. I could not find an escape report for him, not in any of the MI9 files, nothing. His uniforms, incidentally, are now at the National Army Museum. And I went to visit a family in America to look at an archive for Latham House, Wilton Park sort of bugging operation. And blow me, amongst the box of papers was a single escape report. And you can guess whose escape report it was. It was Major General Brummel. Incredible. Anyway, Tubby Brummel, as he was nicknamed, was a Royal Engineer, and he was in a prisoner of war camp, one of the other prisoner of war camps. And of course, he went before the Commandant. The Commandant said to him, well, you know, why are you here then? And he said, well, you know, I'm an expert in tunnelling, and I'm here to teach the others to escape. Well, he ended up in solitary confinement for goodness knows how long, for insolence. But when he was finally released from solitary confinement, he did attempt an escape with some of his fellow men. How did he do it? He was too large to go down into one of the tunnels, so they faked the uniform of a German general. And this I find fascinating, that he actually manages to, down to a T, to recreate these uniforms. And of course, that's how Airey Neave escaped from Colditz. He walked out in German officer uniform. So Brummel, concentrating on his story, they faked the uniform of a German general, and to make the red stripe down the trouser leg, this goes down to the detail, the prisoners had been issued with red shorts so that when they were doing exercises they could be seen from a distance, you know, so if they'd had escaped over the wood they could be seen. Well, of course, they cut this up and stitched it down the side of the trousers. But for me, the best bit of his uniform was the holster for his gun. I mean, the gun was made out of wood from the wooden boxes that had been in little parcels and boxes. The MI9 sent goods into the camps I mentioned. Well, they made the holster for his gun out of chocolate. It made a mould for this holster out of chocolate that MI9 had sent into the camp. And that was great until, of course, he gets halfway down the road, and by then he's quite hot and sweaty and it's all melting down his leg. But the camp guard, actually, he didn't manage to escape, because the camp guard phoned the Commandant and said, we've just looked after your very important guest, the general. And of course, the Commandant said, well, I haven't had any guests today. And at that point, of course, Brummel looks behind him, there's a whole load of people charging after him. He's rearrested and then lands up in Colditz, from which he doesn't escape. Next. I'm keeping an eye on the time, actually. I will keep going, but won't go on for too long. A picture of the prisoners in Colditz. Pat Reed is amongst them. Pat Reed famously later consulted on a lot of the wonderful escape TV programmes, the Colditz series. He's in that photograph. He successfully escapes about 6 months after Airey Neave. You can see their depiction of one of the tunnels. This is in Stalag Luft 3, the famous, where the tunnels Tom, Dick and Harry, as they were known. I find it extraordinary. There's so many stories out of the prisoner of war camps, but I find it extraordinary that they dug so deep and they managed to construct air conditioning, very primitive air conditioning. They had lighting down there. You know, it's a proper job. And some of them were 100 foot down and 300 foot long. It's just quite incredible. And there were ingenious ways of hiding the earth, of course, that they were digging out. One escape I will mention, because it was mentioned in the minutes at Wilson Park. Two of the prisoners, and I'm not sure that it was at Stalag Luft 3, but the Germans had got them painting lines in the camp, and there was a heck of a lot to do. It's quite a large camp, and so they were painting all these white lines around the camp and down the middle of the road, and the guards were often just sort of, you know, laugh at them in the sunshine and just dismiss them and shout rude comments, and these poor guys were sweating, painting the white line. And of course they carried on painting one day. You probably know what's coming. Out the gate, and the guards are still laughing. Out the gate, round the corner, and then they ran off. And they did make it back to Britain. And that's what I love about these stories. It's bonkers, really. It's prisoners thinking of ways to escape, some of them planned, some of them on the spur of the moment. But MI9 had taught them that if they're thinking about ways of escape and evasion, they're keeping mentally sane in captivity. Again, it's all about philosophy, terribly important. Next. So one of the things that I home in on towards the end of my research is this very top secret part of MI9, known as Room 900, also otherwise known as Intelligence School 9. It's quite a large topic. I'm not going to go into any detail, but those two giants, as we mentioned earlier, of MI9, Jimmy Langley on the left there and Ari Neve on the right, they end up heading Room 900, this top secret part of MI9. And Room 900 is sending agents into parts of occupied France, into Europe, into Holland, eventually. Next, please. So they're involved with the agent side, the secret agent side of MI9. And IS9, Intelligence School 9, WEA for Western Europe, actually sent Special Mission Operation Blackmail in 1944 over Holland. And this was where it's very special mission, linking up from the aircraft actually with the use of these new S phones. No idea how they work. As you know, I'm hopeless with technology, but they could communicate short distances with agents on the ground, because communication with Holland had been quite difficult. And it was one of the few places where MI9 needed the help of SOE, the Special Operations Executive. But you'll see in the bottom there, this is part of the team at Wilton Park, but you'll see at the bottom there, their badge. They are flying under the emblem of 3 witches on broomsticks. How cool is that? I think that's a fantastic emblem. And there has been speculation about the meaning behind the 3 witches on broomsticks. It was painted on the aircraft as well. And scholars have actually, and historians have different theories, but personally I think it's from Macbeth, and I think it's, you know, toil and trouble for the Nazis. Next. So I'm coming through towards the sort of end of my PowerPoint, the next 5 minutes or so we've got time for questions. So if we think about the legacy of MI9, and this is a picture of one of the evacuations from Bayonne near the Pyrenees there, with the help of the Grief family and Michael Creswell I mentioned earlier. If you think about the legacy, traditionally we think about MI9 being, and absolutely it was, about escape and evasion, about getting our personnel back from behind enemy lines, because, for example, it would cost up to £15,000 and 3 months to train an airman. We had to have air superiority over the Luftwaffe. We could not afford to lose pilots, and we couldn't train them quick enough. So that was the urgency in supporting the men to come back to fight again. So we know about that. We know about the escape lines. And across the war, MI9 is attributed to saving 35,000 airmen and soldiers. I mean, it's quite a legacy. But it's not just about that. When escapers and evaders came back to Britain, they were interrogated by MI9, sometimes at Wilton Park headquarters, we understand, but often in the Grand Hotel and Marylebone Road. One of the key things which I love about the MI9 interrogators is probably not what you're expecting to hear. The MI9 War Diary says, one of its official histories says, the right kind of woman makes as good as an interrogator as a man. And what I discovered was that at Wilton Park, they were using female interrogators in parallel with the Naval Intelligence team at Latimer House. So MI9 is the only known, with Naval Intelligence, only known service to use female interrogators during the Second World War, and they interrogated not only enemy prisoners of war, but also Allied airmen and soldiers. Next. So for me, looking at MI9's legacy, yes, it's about escape and evasion, but there are, like the file you can see there on the left, thousands upon thousands of not only escape reports, which give information can help other prisoners throughout the war, and those ideas and stuff were printed in the MI9 bulletins, but on your right you can see examples of some of the intelligence reports that were gained from not only prisoners of war, our Allied prisoners, but from agents that are coming back from behind enemy lines. And also, if any of the leaders of those escape lines, any of the helpers had to be brought out, as in the case of Jimmy Langley's wife, Peggy Van Leer, for example, she was at risk, they smuggled her out, they interrogated or debriefed them. And the volumes upon volumes of intelligence that MI9 is collecting, I make a very powerful argument that MI9 was also an intelligence gathering operation. Next. You're probably thinking, what on earth is he doing in my PowerPoint? Well, again, I think always be open-minded in research, because Room 900, there's just one, as far as I found, declassified folder about Room 900's reports that they are sending back to London, and it's being signed by none other than Kim Philby. So it raises very interesting questions, because of course he was in charge of counter-espionage for MI6, and he was based in the Iberian Peninsula for a time in the early part of the war. It raises questions, and I do examine this in the book. What was the relationship between MI9 and MI6? The lines are very blurred, but suddenly we find someone like Kim Philby at the heart of Room 900, working for Room 900, working for MI9 and MI6? Or is Room 900 part of MI6 embedded in MI9? There you go, I'll leave you with that question. Next. I'm going to wrap up shortly. At the very end of the war, MI9 spent 1945-46, and in some cases, I think even with Italy into 47 and beyond, sent teams out to trace the helpers, the guides. Florentino there on your right, clearly with emotion on his face, and they were rewarded. They were given awards for their work, and Americans did exactly the same. Janine de Grief there receiving one of her awards. And this is the point at which these helpers begin to understand that it was MI9 that was helping them all along, that was sending agents, that was sending money to them. But MI9 repaid financially families, not just these of escape lines, but those that were supporting the escape lines, ordinary households that would be financially, will have given up food, money, for helping the escape lines, and they were rewarded at the end of the war. Very few of their names have been released, and even to this day, they are protected. Their names are protected. Next. I'm coming to my last slide. So Elsie Marshall, that I interviewed and I mentioned earlier, the lady who for me, was the turning point. As I said, we're at the very end of the eyewitnesses to this history. There are a couple others of the Comet line that I did not get a chance to interview. They're not well enough to be interviewed now. So we are losing that human part of the story, I think, and gaining that understanding. And for me, as a historian, I think that's very sad that we won't have their side of the story. It doesn't mean we shouldn't still keep these alive, and we shouldn't still be researching it. But for her, the heart of everything they did, why did they do it? We've covered that. But for her, at the very end, she said to me, it was about freedom and democracy everywhere that actually defines what we do. And I'm going to finish with a quote, which is very similar, that I finished with in the book, from Peggy Van Leer. Peggy Van Leer, who helped on the Comet line, who went on to marry Jimmy Langley. She was smuggled out in a boat of oranges from Spain. And she wrote, and I'll finish with her words, the despair, the humiliation, the anger at German occupation was so deep that one felt ready to do anything to regain the priceless treasure of freedom. And it is only when one has lost freedom that one realizes it is the most precious thing. And I think for me, that's also the legacy of this MI9, this secret service that's been forgotten in World War II. And I think that's a message for us today, just how precious democracy and freedom is. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Helen. That was absolutely fascinating, absolutely fascinating. And I was sort of just glancing at the end of your book. I mean, there's quite a chunk with all your notes and references. I mean, so well researched, so well researched. Yeah, absolutely amazing. Now, I do have a question here, if you could bear with. Okay, it's from Richard. Were pilots who escaped back to Britain allowed to resume operational flights? As they would know the escape route, wouldn't that be a risk if they were captured again?
They did fly again, and some lost their lives in action, which again I find extraordinary, that, you know, some of them made that escape back and then back into action. Not all of them did, but yeah, they could fly again. That was the whole purpose, really, of bringing them back and not giving the order at that point to stay put in the prisoner of war camps. And the fact, of course, that they knew the escape lines, well, it's very limited. So they only know, they don't see the overall picture that we've got today. They will only know certain links in the chain. And they were told not to write down ever the name and address of anyone who'd helped them. Again, because that could be a piece of paper if they were recaptured along the route at any point. So there was no risk in that sense that the lines would be betrayed. And the other thing which MI9 taught them before they went into action, under no circumstances were they to go looking for or asking for about members of the escape lines, that people would know locally, the local knowledge would be, oh, there's an airman hiding in the woods, go and find him. That's one of the jobs Elsie Marshall had to do when they knew there was a downed airman, for example.
And it's a question from me, and apologies if it's very naive question, but what's left of Wilton Park? And can you visit it? I'm sorry, I don't know.
No, nothing.
Nothing.
No, nothing.
When was it destroyed?
Yeah, so yeah, there was a campaign, wasn't there, which I sort of lent support to, and it was demolished in 2014, if I'm not mistaken. The last World War II bit of the building, sheen block, that was used into the Cold War, the top end of the site, it's near the, I think they're married quarters, aren't they, that are still there. They're boarded around because it's being developed now. After the war, as many of you locally will know, it was still an army training centre and became the Army Languages Education Centre. And then it was bought by a developer. So my understanding is the houses have started to go up, but the developer demolished the last, not illegally at that point. There were attempts to have it listed, but they were incredible because they were purpose-built in the wartime, looked very similar to some of the blocks at Bletchley Park, and of course very similar to the stuff that was at Latimer House. But there was hopes, I think the mayor at one point of Beaconsfield had hoped it could be a little museum up there because it was tucked away at the far end, but no, not to be.
Oh, that is sad, isn't it? That that little bit of history's gone forever. So is there a plaque or just nothing, absolutely nothing?
Well, there is talk of naming some of the streets after key historic bits, like Kendrick after the commanding officer of the bugging operation, but that's nothing to do with me. I've been asked to support a couple of the streets' names from the wartime period, but I do think it's a shame because, and maybe because people didn't really realise the significance of what happened at Wilton Park in terms of intelligence gathering alongside Latimer House and Bletchley Park. It's now been recognised as instrumental in changing the war. The intelligence they gained, whether it was from the escape and evasion wing or whether it was from the bugging operation down the end of the site, You know, you look at this together, but we're still in our infancy as historians in analysing the sheer volumes of material that's coming out of MI9.
So when did you decide to do the book about MI9, and what gave you the impetus to choose this particular area?
Well, I fell into it, as you fall into most projects, I suppose. I came across MI9 from a veteran, from a secret listener, Fritz Lustig. So he was involved in the whole bugging operation at Latimer House and Wilton Park. And he was the veteran that said to me, did we do anything that made any difference to the war? And so I promised to tell that story. So I spent about 10, 15 years piecing together. It's come in 2 phases, as you know. And after that, asked to write a book on the London Cage, which you've had in stock at your bookshop. Again, that was part of MI9. So that's the darker side of an interrogation centre linked to all of this, part of MI9 in Kensington Palace Gardens. And then after that, it was Yale that said to me, well, you know, the other part of MI9 that you sort of mentioned, the escape and evasion wing from Wilton Park, no one's written a history of this for 40 years. And when we sat down and thought about this together, I just did find that astounding that no one, there have been various escape stories, but no one has written the history of MI9 since the files have been declassified. And of course, that was the one thing which frustrated Foote and Langley and Airy Neave, that they didn't have access to the original files. They were still classified. So I think it's quite a task, really. But I realised what was on my hands, and how do you follow those giants? But yeah, you have to try.
Huge undertaking, absolutely huge undertaking. So when were the files declassified? Sorry if you've already mentioned that.
They came out, it took like with the bugging operation, huge chunks of them took years to come out. If I'm not mistaken, in the late 1990s.
So comparatively recently then.
Yeah. Well, in terms of the bugging operation, the 100,000 files or whatever just on that section of MI9, it took 5 years for someone at the War Office to go through them and check that there was nothing sensitive in them. So they didn't finally come out, they were to come out in tranches until 2004. So again, and I started using them in 2005. So it's not that long ago, really.
No, it isn't, is it? Oh, well, thank you, Helen, so much. We could go on. I mean, it's such a big subject, as you say, and so interesting, all these stories, and you make it just come alive. You know, you're just such a brilliant historian. You make it so accessible. And you know, the good news is, well, this book has been reprinted. I mean, it's straight into a reprint. It's doing really well, and obviously, I wish you all the success for the book. And we have actual signed copies at both the Chorleywood and the Gerrards Cross, not plates, just actual signed copies. And of your latest book, The Walls Have Ears, in paperback. So we've got actual signed copies. And if anybody wants a particular dedication, I know, you know, we are able to get this in time for Christmas. Helen will come in and she'll sign further copies, and she will do dedications. So that's really special. So, you know, for the historian in your life, this is the present that you must put into their hands. So what better present? So Helen, I mean, it's such a fascinating, fantastic evening. Thank you so much. Great presentation, and lovely. I wish you all the success with the book. And
thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you.